creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions, then of course it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized. Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine.
Since the 1960s, Noam Chomsky has been the voice of a very characteristic brand of rationalist libertarian socialism. He's attacked the abuses of power wherever he saw them. He's made himself deeply unpopular by his criticism of American policy, the subservience of the intelligentsia, the degradation of Zionism, the distortions of media and self-delusions in prevailing ideologies.
Under the liberal administrations of the 1960s, the club of academic intellectuals designed and implemented the Vietnam War and other similar, though smaller, actions. This particular community is a very relevant one to consider at a place like MIT because, of course, you're all free to enter this community. In fact, you're invited and encouraged to enter the community of technical intelligentsia and weapons designers and counterinsurgency experts and pragmatic planners of an American empire is one that you have a great deal of inducement to become associated with. The inducements, in fact, are very real. The rewards in power and affluence and prestige and authority are quite...
Jamie. This came with the mail. Be with you in a second. Oh God, they still got their cameras. Okay?
Huh? I want to start. In your essay, Language and Freedom, you write, social action must be animated by a vision of a future society. I was wondering what vision of a future society animates you?
Oh, well, I have my own ideas as to what a future society should look like. I've written about them. I mean, I think that we should, at the most general level, we should be seeking out forms of authority and domination and challenging their legitimacy. Now, sometimes they are legitimate. That is, let's say, they're needed for survival. So, for example, I wouldn't suggest that during the Second World War, the forms of authority, we had a totalitarian society, basically, and I thought there was some justification for that under the wartime conditions. And there are other forms of, relations between parents and children, for example, involve forms of coercion, which are sometimes justifiable. But any form of coercion and control requires justification, and most of them are completely unjustifiable. Now, at various stages of human civilization, it's been possible to challenge some of them, but not others. Others are too deep-seated, or you don't see them, or whatever. And so at any particular point, you try to detect those forms of authority and domination which are subject to change, and which do not have any legitimacy, in fact, which often strike at fundamental human rights and your understanding of fundamental human nature and rights. Well, what are the major things, say, today? There are some that are being addressed in a way. The feminist movement is addressing some. The civil rights movement is addressing others. The one major one that's not being seriously addressed is the one that's really at the core of the system of domination, and that's private control over resources. And that means an attack on the fundamental structure of state capitalism. Now, I think that's in order. That's not something far off in the future.
Your life work.
The alphabet has only 26 letters. With these 26 magic symbols, however, millions of words are written every day.
Nowhere else are people so addicted to information and entertainment via the printed word. Every day the world comes thumping on the American doorstep, and nothing that happens anywhere remains long a secret from the American newspaper reader. It comes to us pretty casually, the daily paper. But behind its arrival on your doorstep is one of journalism's major stories, how it got there.
There is a standard view about democratic societies and the role of the media within them. It's expressed, for example, by Supreme Court Justice Powell when he spoke of the crucial role of the media in affecting the societal purpose of the First Amendment, namely enabling the public to assert meaningful control over the political process. That kind of formulation expresses the understanding that democracy requires free access to information and ideas and opinion, and the same conceptions hold not only with regard to the media, but with regard to educational institutions, publishing, the intellectual community generally.
It is basic to the health of a democracy that no phase of government activity escape the scrutiny of the press. Here, reporters are assigned to stories fateful not only to our nation, but to all nations. Congress, says the First Amendment, shall pass no law abridging the freedom of the press. And the chief executive himself throws open the doors of the White House to journalists representing papers of all shades of political opinion.
But it is worth bearing in mind that there is a contrary view. And in fact, the contrary view is very widely held and deeply rooted in our own civilization. It goes back to the origins of modern democracy, to the 17th century English Revolution, which was a complicated affair like most popular revolutions. There was a struggle between Parliament, representing largely elements of the gentry and the merchants, and the royalists, representing other elite groups, and they fought it out. But like many popular revolutions, there was also a lot of popular ferment going on that was opposed to all of them. There were popular movements that were questioning everything. The relation between master and servant, the right of authority altogether, all kinds of things were being questioned. There was a lot of radical publishing. The printing presses had just come into existence. And this disturbed all the elites on both sides of the Civil War. So as one historian pointed out at the time, in 1660, he criticized the radical Democrats, the ones who were calling for what we would call democracy, because they are making the people so curious and so arrogant that they will never find humility enough to submit to a civil rule. Now, underlying these doctrines, which were very widely held, is a certain conception of democracy. It's a game for elites. It's not for the ignorant masses who have to be marginalized, diverted, and controlled, of course, for their own good. The same principles were upheld in the American colonies. The dictum of the founding fathers of American democracy that, I'm quoting, the people who own the country ought to govern it, quoting John Jay. Fire! Now, in modern times, for elites, this contrary view about the intellectual life and the media and so on, this contrary view, in fact, is the standard one, I think, apart from rhetorical flourishes.
From Washington, D.C., he's intellectual, author, and linguist, Professor Noam Chomsky. Manufacturing Consent. What is that title meant to describe?
Well, the title is actually borrowed from a book by Walter Lippmann, written back around 1921, in which he described what he called the manufacture of consent as a revolution in the practice of democracy. What it amounts to is a technique of control. And he said this was useful and necessary because the common interests, the general concerns of all people, elude the public. The public just isn't up to dealing with them, and they have to be the domain of what he called a specialized class. Notice that that's the opposite of the standard view about democracy. There's a version of this expressed by the highly respected moralist and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who was very influential on contemporary policymakers. His view was that rationality belongs to the cool observer, but because of the stupidity of the average man, he follows not reason but faith. And this naive faith requires necessary illusion and emotionally potent oversimplifications, which are provided by the myth maker to keep the ordinary person on course. It's not the case, as the naive might think, that indoctrination is inconsistent with democracy. Rather, as this whole line of thinkers observes, it's the essence of democracy. The point is that in a military state or a feudal state or what we would nowadays call a totalitarian state, it doesn't much matter what people think, because you've got a bludgeon over their head and you can control what they do. But when the state loses the bludgeon, when you can't control people by force, and when the voice of the people can be heard, you have this problem. It may make people so curious and so arrogant that they don't have the humility to submit to a civil rule, and therefore you have to control what people think. And the standard way to do this is to resort to what in more honest days used to be called propaganda, manufacture of consent, creation of necessary illusions, various ways of either marginalizing the general public or reducing them to apathy in some fashion.
Noam Chomsky 教授は1928年
The oldest of two boys, Abraham Noam Chomsky, was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1928. As a Jewish child, the anti-Semitism of the time affected him. Both parents taught Hebrew, and he became fascinated by literature, reading translations of French and Russian classics. He also took an interest in a grammar book written by his father on Hebrew of the Middle Ages. He recalls a childhood absorbed in reading, curled up in a sofa, often borrowing up to 12 books at once from the library. He is married to Carol, and they have 3 children.
I don't like to impose on my wife and children a form of life that they certainly haven't selected for themselves, namely one of public exposure or exposure to the public media. That's their choice, and I don't believe that they have themselves selected this. I don't impose it on them. I would like to protect them from it, frankly. Second, the sort of perhaps principal point is that I'm rather against the idea, the whole notion of developing public personalities who are treated as stars of one kind or another, where aspects of their personal life are